Okay, we're going to graph y equals negative 2 sine 3x plus pi over 2 minus 5 without Desmos. Step 1, I'm going to do these problems in steps. So step 1, we're going to find the period. Okay, remember the period formula is 2 pi over the absolute value, of b. And looking at my equation, I know that my b is 3. So it'll be 2 pi over the absolute value of 3, which is 2 pi over 3. So one cycle is completed in 2 pi over 3 units. All right, step 2. I'm going to divide the period by 4. So that'll be 2 pi divided by 4. I'm dividing the length of a segment. So just think of this segment is from 0 to 2 pi over 3. I needed them 4 equal parts because I need to find the max, the min, the midline, and everything of the graph. So I have 2 pi over 3. I got to flip the 4 to 1/4. I have 2 pi over 12, which is just pi over 6. So the length of each unit on this number line is pi over 6. So if I start at 0 and I add pi over 6 units, I'm at pi over 6. If I add another pi over 6, I'm at 2 pi over 6, which is pi over 3. If I add another pi over 6 to 2 pi over 6, I'm at 3 pi over 6, which is pi over 2. And if I add another pi over 6 to 3 pi over 6, I'm at 4 pi over 6, which is 2 pi over 3. So this is really 4 pi over 6, but we reduce it to 2 pi over 3. Those would be my angles if I did not have a horizontal shift. So I'm going to have to shift all these angles in step 3. So step 3, I need to find my horizontal shift. So find the horizontal phase shift. And that is just the negative c over absolute value of b. So in the equation, c is pi over 2. So it'll be negative pi over 2 divided by the absolute value of b, and b is 3. So it'll be negative pi over 2 times a third, which is negative pi over 6. So all of the angles here are going to shift negative pi over 6 or pi over 6 to the left. So I'm going to actually do this with a number line. So I'm going to draw my number line. I'm going to put my original angles before the shift as 0, pi over 6, pi over 3, pi over 2, and 2 pi over 3. And since I'm shifting to the left, I have to subtract from my starting point. So I'm subtracting every angle by negative pi over 6. That's moving it to the left. So I'm going to get 0 minus pi over 6 is just negative pi over 6. Pi over 6 minus pi over 6, I'm moving that to 0. Pi over 3 minus pi over 6 is going to be pi over 6. Pi over 2 minus pi over 6, I'm going to move it to pi over 3. 2 pi over 3 minus pi over 6, that's going to be pi over 2. So I'm just subtracting these. And I can actually do this on the calculator, which helps it out. So what I did, I shifted all the angles in step 2. So shifted all angles in step 2 to the left pi over 6 units. Okay. All right, so these are my new angles here. These are my x values I'm going to substitute into a t-table and find the y values for those x values. So step 4, I'm going to make a table. Step 4, I'm going to make a t-table. And my x values are going to be what was on my number line: pi over 6, 0, pi over 6, pi over 3, and pi over 2. My y values are going to be, when I plug those or substitute those x values in for y, you could actually do this on the calculator, maybe a little bit faster. So when I substitute negative pi over 6, I'm going to have negative 2 times sine of 3 times negative pi over 6 plus pi over 2 minus 5. And if I just put it in a calculator just like I have it here, I'm going to get negative 5. If I substitute in for x for 0, well, substitute 0 in for x, I'm going to get negative 7. When I substitute pi over 6 in for x, I'm going to get negative 5. When I substitute pi over 3 for x, I will get negative 3. And if I substitute pi over 2 in for x, I would get negative 5. So the condensed part of my t-table is going to be negative pi over 6. I'm going to plot negative 5. At 0, I'm going to plot negative 7. At pi over 6, I'm going to be at negative 5. At pi over 3, I will be at negative 3. And at pi over 2, I will be at negative 5. And I'm going to apply negative pi over 6 here. And then I have 0. At the origin, I have pi over 6, pi over 3, and pi over 2. So I'm going down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Oh, that looks terrible. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So at negative pi over 6, I should be at negative 5, so I'm right here. At 0, I should be at negative 7, so I'm right here. At pi over 6, I'm at negative 5. At pi over 3, I'm at negative 3. And at pi over 2, I'm at negative 5. So my curve is going to do this. I'm going to move up, and I'm going to be down like that. So, and this would be one period from negative pi over 6 over to pi over 2. This is one period of the graph. If I repeat, I can draw another period. And that's all you need to do.